rather than having you talk about what came up, I'm going to save that, hoping we'll have a little bit at the time at the end for conversations and processing and discussion. But I'd like to go a little further into the presentation here and talk about a little more concretely healing directions. And some of the words you're going to see here may seem soft in the face of what we're looking at, but I think it's partly because we're going down deep. We're going to the underbelly of transformation and change. So we've talked a lot about connection, how things are interrelated, and I want to add another layer to that and maybe even give a couple of examples. So there's something called social currency, that in communities, it's where, and I'm sure there are some smaller towns where this is still true, but it's the kind of community where, let's say the power does go out, you know who the person is in your neighborhood who has a generator. You know who the person is in your neighborhood who might need help getting out of their house if there's a need to evacuate. There's this social network where people know each other, care about each other, have your back kind of perspective that, again, is part of what we've lost in so many places in our fierce independence. And so it's another type of connection. And they say that especially when there have been climate-related disasters, that the areas that had strong social currency, whether they had a lot of financial resources or less, did much better. In terms of both survival, resilience, all kinds of things. It's just essential, that connection. And let me give you also a couple of examples of, with this work, I hope you can hear that I'm really not saying we all need to become advocates in the sense of signing petitions or carrying signs, which is great if you want to do that, and I do that sometimes, but that if we can live this perspective and understand it and know it, and then apply it to wherever we are and wherever our natural engagement is, and assuming people in other fields do that too, it's going to roll out. We don't all have to become climate scientists. We don't all have to become solar engineers. We have to do our part in this whole thing. So for example, let's say you had as a client an engineer who was about to give a very large presentation at a conference on sustainability technology, but they were terrified of public speaking. Not that uncommon to come into our practice. So if we do our role of working with them so that they can effectively then stand up at the podium and transmit what they have to offer, and then there's going to be all the people in the audience are touched by that, our role is linked to theirs. And then that speaker is linked to everyone who hears it. And let's say someone in the audience puts it up on YouTube. We don't have to be all things to all people, but we can take what we do and know and be part of this rollout. And that's one example. I'll give you another one is, I gave a talk about 2 months ago on this topic, and up in Washington, and someone in the audience worked for the county and asked to meet with me afterwards and was describing that they were taking on a project of trying to resolve some conflicts between the agricultural rural community and urban development, and kind of where those were starting to meet, and the competition over resources like water. And so in kind of as an informal consultant, I talked with them quite a bit about structuring facilitated conversations, not too different than we might do with a wedding couple who are suddenly really contentious and can't talk to each other anymore. But how do you have one person speak and the others just listen, validate, acknowledge that they are understanding what's being expressed, and then switch roles and so forth. And so they're actually starting to roll out a series of meetings where it's going to start with one-on-one meetings where they got funding for the ranchers or the farmers to be paid to come and just sit and talk, which is fantastic. They could be paid for their time. That after some of that happens, it's going to go to groups of about 6 and 6. And then they hope to open it up to a larger format. So that's not something I set out to do, but by sharing some of these perspectives and them knowing my role in training in psychotherapy, it became kind of a natural fit for how to apply this, not just in the therapy room, but on more of a kind of policy level. Eventually, it'll probably move to some policy decisions. So you never quite know how it may manifest. Deep listening. So that's both in terms of what I was just expressing about listening to each other, but also that form of listening within. You know, that famous Einstein saying, if we can't solve problems by the same perspective that they were created, I think it's going to take a different kind of inquiry to really shift in this transformative process. So listening to each other, listening within. And as part of that, you know, a very, very real, you know, thinking outside the box. This really is about doing things differently. And creativity is where there's room to experiment and feel that and go, maybe this, you know, I hadn't ever thought of that before. Several of you mentioned being in the present moment, being present as we can become more strong and resilient so that we can dare to be present to strong opposing views, pain and suffering. We already get a lot of practice in that. Trauma, it can't be underscored how essential that is in moving forward. This is a tricky word, commitment, because it can sort of conjure up the idea of, well, don't be telling me what I should be doing with my time, right? Don't commit to what? And really what I mean here is that some of you may have heard this story that Angeles Arrien used to tell. She was a cultural anthropologist, and she would, you know, try and study a lot of cultures globally and look for common themes. And she told a story that I guess has versions in many cultures. And she said there are 2 voices whispering in our ears through our life. Let me see if I remember this correctly. One is death and one is destiny. So destiny asks us, are you doing what you've come here to do? Are you doing what you've come here to do? And only you can answer that. And only you can probably answer that through some form of deep listening, creative, open mind, open heart. And the commitment is, can you be committed to that? Are you whatever it is that you've come here to do? And the question from death is, are you using your time here well? Are you using your time here well? And that's really what I mean by commitment. It's so easy to get distracted, right? But are we listening? And that might evolve and change what we've come here to do. May not stay the same in your life. And then are you devoting your time to that? Is it being prioritized? And just resolute compassion for ourselves, for others, for this whole messy business that we're in. And then I would say that resiliency in a way is all of those combined. You know, again, how to be present, open-hearted, with depth, with compassion, with connection. And I don't think I'm going to do this now. There's a way to do a meditation to kind of listen to the heart of the earth. But just to even consider that possibility. You know, another type of deep listening is listening to the voices within us. But especially in some of the indigenous tradition, they say that nature is speaking to us all the time. that there's a way to, not necessarily in words, but listen, feel, trees. I think someone talking about the walk and forest bathing, it's a much more whole being, whole body experience, but sometimes there's a message that comes with that. It just might be a message about our own aliveness. It might be a message of getting back on track. It might be a realigning of priorities. A lot can happen. But listening also to nature. So what if you approached your therapy practice, and you may already be doing this, understanding that all of life is interconnected? How would that influence, if that was a lens by which you were relating to each of your clients and your colleagues and your work, your teaching, whatever it is you do, your supervision? And that you stand for a sustainable, just, and fulfilling future. You also assist clients to inquire deeply. And you help facilitate clients to put forth a new story. So let me give an example of the dilemma we're facing. And I don't know that, there's an immediate answer, but it's the kind of things I think we need to chew on and look at and turn over. So let's say you have a client come to you. This wouldn't be that unusual, who wants to be more successful in their career. And you might say, well, how are you going to know when you've achieved your goals? And they would say, well, I would know that because every winter I could go on as many ski outings as I wanted, and I could eat at my favorite seafood restaurants. And so you help them maybe get over some esteem issues, or help them organize their lives, or look at old stories or beliefs that might sabotage their efforts of creating this life for themselves. But what if you're also aware that the career they're choosing has a very high carbon footprint? So much so that it might contribute to a lower snow season, or no snow season, or not having their favorite fish on the menu anymore. Is that another type of self-sabotage? Are you helping them to try and achieve something that may be working against them when it comes to a sustainability lens? And it's difficult. We're not here to tell people what to do. But how do we start to define, what's unhealthy, and how far does that reach in terms of affecting them and affecting others? And I think it's the kind of question that we have to reevaluate and just look at. So what if we just didn't tell people they had to come in and talk about this topic, but we just let them know that it's the kind of thing that can be welcome in the therapy room? When you hear about, along with your other assessment questions in an intake form, what are the things that bother you? We already asked about the stressors, but sometimes, I'm sure you've gotten some people coming in, especially with politics and the state of the world, coming in and talking about their distress. But what if it was just simply invited, so that now or another time that it was clearly something that was affiliated and associated with part of what we offer as therapists? When you hear about what's happening in the world, including climate change, do you feel no distress, moderately distressed, extremely distressed? Becomes a potential launching point at now or later. And so much of what I'm saying is really built into how we're trained. So we can help our clients process full range of emotions triggered by climate chaos, help them anchor their resiliency in order to act in alignment with their values, support our clients to cultivate deep connections, to build that social capital, which sometimes runs counter to social media, which I'm on too. I'm just trying to add to, not necessarily have a strong stance about what we shouldn't be doing. Create space for our clients to explore safely, being open to life's challenges with courage and creativity. Reflect back how valuable and unique their presence, voices, and contributions can be in shaping our world. as a counter to that we can't do anything. We already do that in other ways, but it includes this larger spectrum. Help them find their role and purpose. Encourage relationship with the natural world. It could be that some of these things become so recognized and so conscious that it won't be like an unusual thing to do. It may be a more common recommended prescription, but at this point it's still a little bit adding to what we might normally consider. Support clients in recognizing that caring for the natural world is an investment in their own well-being. Help individuals, couples, communities build internal resilience that will stabilize their ability to function well in whatever field they go into, treating trauma, anxiety, and depression. Cultivate creativity, communication skills, create increased tolerance or build resiliency for intense feelings. And how to make change. How to do that. You might know the term disenfranchised grief. This is sort of a disenfranchised grief. It's the kind of thing where there's not a very socially acceptable acknowledgement that it's something worth grieving. It used to be true about, for example, the death of a pet, but I think that's much more in our consciousness now, or the impact of a divorce, things that people weren't as comfortable speaking about, miscarriage. And I really think that climate change grief is a sort of disfranchised grief. Unless you've got some people with a similar mind frame, they just call you too sensitive or exaggerating or one of those weirdos, So to really make room for that, lots of self-care and connecting with others. And that in doing this work, we have to attend to our own care. And when we have our conversation, and I think we will have a little bit of time for that, I'm sure questions might be popping up about, well, where'd you get these statistics or things? There's quite a bit of good, reliable, scientifically based information out there. And these are a few that I can recommend. If you are someone who wanted to this piqued your curiosity enough that you want to just stay more abreast, there's a free online newsletter called Eco Watch, I think it is, and they basically summarize anything related that's been out in the news. They'll do a little bullet point and then a link to the source. So it's a good way to just kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what's current. And then, if this is something you're interested in, I actually created a textbook that I'm hoping will be adopted. My secret desire is I would love to get some kind of training as a required part of becoming a mental health professional. Those things get added all the time. I just think we're going to be called upon more and more as these changes happen in the world. And as far as I've gotten so far, it's just continuing education credit. So I do have an online course, 6 CEU credits through JFK on this topic. And going into much more depth and including other things is in this book if you're interested, which is someone has a copy here, and it's on Amazon and all those usual places. And for questions or thoughts that go beyond the scope of what we can do here together, just know that I'm very open to being in touch. Anyone who has interest in this topic and wants support or wants to add new ideas, I'm also wanting to really cultivate those kinds of connections, so feel free to reach out to me. So we have about 20-25 minutes. And I'd like to maybe just open this up. There hasn't really been much of an opportunity other than those brief little processing with each other. But questions or concerns that are coming up, if it feels inappropriate for this to be like a mental health theme, love to hear your thoughts on that. or work you're already doing. A couple of you I talked to before we started were here because you're excited about this topic and doing something with it. So let's just kind of open it up and see where it goes.
There's a few things I kind of want to link together, and that would be starting with the idea of the shadow. And I grew up in Wisconsin. I regularly ate, dairy, meat, and so forth. And my 25-year-old daughter, 3 years ago, sat me down and said, Dad, you need to be a vegan. And she explained why, and it took me about, honestly, 30 seconds, and I told her I'm in. And my feeling is that you could add greatly to this presentation if you don't already are aware of the fact that, how we have, as human beings, have split ourselves off, from nature, especially from animals, in terms of what we eat on a daily basis. And yes. My daughter could put so many statistics out in 2 minutes that I can't about yes. its effects on, carbon yes. in the air, and that we do not, in fact, need to eat meat, that we can live, which we do, or I do, and yes. my family does, on a plant-based, kind of diet. It's overwhelming how dark that side is of what we don't start with ourselves about what we eat on a day-by-day basis. Yes. And then just finally, just to show you how it affects a vegan like myself. Yes. When you refer to the success of a person who can go and eat their favorite fish, in a restaurant where they go skiing, what we don't see is the fish flopping on the deck, suffocating the way we would suffocate. And telling me about their wonderful success, I might, in as subtle way as I could, say, wow, I wonder what it's like to drown except to suffocate like a fish. Yeah. And let's think about that the next time you have your favorite fish up in Tahoe.
Yes, thank you. And I hope you were hearing and giving that examples of me pointing out that there are problems infiltrated with those kind of goals, which are not uncommon in our clients. And for those of you who are not familiar, in addition to what you've shared about kind of the animal welfare aspect, the methane that cows in particular release contributes a huge amount to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so some people look at it in a stepped down way, like cows are the worst, pigs and lamb are a bit less, chicken are less, fish are less. And so for some people, it's almost like a harm reduction model if they're not willing to make that radical of a change or don't look at the animal welfare component. But there are people for sure in this climate arena who are saying, if all of us just even ate less beef, it would be a huge benefit to the climate. So you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah, I have an interest in epidemiology. I have a medical background, and I'm interested in knowing, in this age of misinformation, what reliable sources we can get. I've heard mixed reviews about the CDC and WHO, frankly. I'm interested in understanding the things like the level with which the permafrost is melting and basically exposing latent bacteria and viruses, and what that kind of impact that's going to have on all of us.
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. I didn't know if you have a good, strong resource for accurate information.
I
for that.
really don't. I mean, other than the things that I had listed before, which are more general, I think, this is such a time of trying to sort out what information can you trust,
Yeah.
especially scientifically. And you're right, besides the viruses and things with the melting permafrost, you probably know it, that also says that it's sitting on a whole bunch of methane,
Yeah.
which will be released into the atmosphere. So again, some of these things are not gradual, but that there may be significant exacerbations and jumps about when one thing happens. It's not just that one thing. Then there's this rollout of this other consequence. Yeah.
Well, what I wanted to mention was more of an environmental conflict. To me, a lot of the things that I've learned about global warming and climate change have been through travel and noticing various places in the world, things that are happening. I was talking to my friend here a minute ago about seeing in Costa Rica huge container ships all bringing bananas to America, But my conflict is flying also has a huge carbon footprint.
Yes. Yes. It kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about these very real built-in ambivalences and conflicts, that things have a benefit in one way and a huge cost in the other. And like a lot of change, it has to start with awareness. At least that's true. And that can be factored into your choices. I'm I told you, in the same boat of just family and work obligations that have me right now in 2 locations. And it creates a dilemma. There's good that's coming out of it, and there's kind of a cost there environmentally to what I'm speaking to that I don't quite know how to resolve at this point. Yeah, but the willingness to wrestle with it and look and, consider what you can do when you can do it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's necessary that we keep that in mind if we're going to live in this world.
Yeah.
I find it very difficult myself, being an advocate for humanistic and earthly things. The difficulty comes up when you need to model that to your client. And do you say you should recycle? I mean, this is a difficult spot to be in because I'm out in the community a lot doing work with homeless people. What do I do when I'm sitting in front of a woman who is losing her children because she doesn't have a home? Mm-hmm. I find that very hard to juggle.
Yeah.
Maybe some comments around that area. And please also note that I've put a little box up there to recycle our utensils, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And, I would welcome anyone else who wants to weigh in with suggestions on this too. Because we are clinicians, there's always that kind of art and science of attending to what the needs and hierarchy of priorities are. And so you aren't going to switch the topic if they come in with a different need to check on how much recycling they do. You know what I mean? But I think the fact that we carry it in our consciousness and there may be natural openings, or we include an assessment question about, how do you feel when you recognize what's happening in the world? People might even ask, what do you mean, or why is that on there? And there just may be ways that, I'm hopeful. And it's also like, I do believe this is going to start to become almost like a specialization. When you were doing introductions, some of you work with kids and some of you work in addiction. And I do think that for people who either have been touched by an event or know people who've been touched by an event or carry an eco-anxiety worry. And part of what you provide is a therapy that is inclusive of these kinds of themes. It will also be a more obvious platform. So I think it's just a combination of carrying it within the scope of what you provide as a therapist, and either looking for those natural openings or knowing that people may eventually even seek it out.
I'm gonna call myself. Yeah. I just wanted to speak to, as clinicians, just being really aware of shame. So I've worked in the field of domestic violence and high conflict couples and anger management for a long time. So lots of people come into my office with regrettable behaviors that they have a lot of shame about. Mm-hmm. And I think using the learning from that in this area about that, if you sit with somebody with regrettable behavior that's trying to make a change and you go through the avenue of shame, they will be stunted.
Yep.
And so really finding other avenues rather than, this. And when someone's acutely aware that they have a guilt or they have a discordant experience with the earth or with life around them, not really jumping on that, but really going in the avenue of mirroring and twinning and then opening that way. So welcoming inside, so you're there together versus, I've already made those changes, but we can say that really subtly. Mm-hmm. And we can gesture that very subtly. And so I think we really need to maybe call on ourselves and remember our own journeys to these places. And then also really, as people said, the way of compassion, I think is a way to invite rather than sending people into the fight or flight experience.
Beautiful, thank you, yep.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of echo what John was saying. I took an undergrad class called Psychology of the Wilderness at Sonoma State 20 years ago. And the premise was about how disconnected from dirt, organic, outside nature, how disconnected we are from the earth. Little story is we work in a box, we leave the box, we get into a box, we drive to the Jack in the Box, and then, drive home to a box and sleep on a box, in a box. And so this return to who we are and what we're of and what we're from and that what we'll become, because we're so shielded from it, we're so removed from it. And I think I was 20 years ago, and I think now, 20 years later, the young people, maybe even more, with the FaceTime and the and so, and I love that about the not shaming. That was spot on for me, and our whole table was like, So being with, and instead of focus on what maybe they're not doing or what they should do, get folks back to the dirt, and back to the dirt in our hands, and an appreciation for the dirt is going to translate into an appreciation for the animals, which can translate into, as more of a stepping off as a starting point for the work I'm doing. So beautiful. I just wanted to add that in.
Thank you.
This isn't so much a question as just a comment because it hasn't been mentioned. One is many of my clients who have childhood trauma, abuse history, they're very environmentally active, and I will point to them that there's a direct connection that they grew up realizing that it does matter, and that's why they're drawn to it, because they get a lot of flack for being so environmentally active. And so I just wanted to put that out because it hasn't been mentioned here. And the other thing is about denial, that it occurs to me there's two levels of working with denial. There could be denial in the client, but our clients are also dealing with denial out there. We have a president totally in denial, and the frustration and the difficulty of dealing with that out in the world.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Pardon? I think we still have about, yeah, almost 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes.
Just quickly, I don't know if this has been mentioned, but I almost always ask my clients to reconnect with nature, to calm themselves. And that's a start. It's always a start. You know, when you go and walk by the sea or you go out into nature, that's where you learn to reconnect and how it soothes you. So that's a good start.
Yes, that's reminding me, I've been hearing about a version of grounding homework where the request is that they, you know, have their bare feet, no shoes or socks, directly on the earth, and to do that for 10 minutes or whatever it is, so that those are starting to be more brought back in.
I just add that as a clinician, Jung referred to the psyche as image, and so rather than feeling the ego pressure to change things, I think it's being open to the images that occur that can come by way of daydreams, dreams, fantasies, and the image that's embedded in thoughts and so forth. So the climate comes by way of image, to us as clinicians, and being able to be open to those and at times offer alternative images to consider is a way of helping heal, the climate, so to speak.
I completely agree. Some of what I very briefly referred to as kind of that deep listening or inquiry, in my personal experience and practice, it often usually bubbles up as imagery. Yeah.
So just to piggyback on a couple of things that were said in terms of bringing nature into our practice, because I think that is such a wonderful, stepping stone into people's awareness of how interconnected we are with nature. And I have a courtyard in my building where I could just take people down where there's trees and sit with them and teach them just how to open their senses up and feel that calming, right before we start, on 1 to 10, where are you at? And then sitting and closing your eyes and listening for the, distant sound of the bird. Mm-hmm. And noticing how calming that is, doing that with clients. And the other thing is just bringing in those images when people are talking as metaphors. Like, I have a 12-year-old boy who has really difficult body image issues, and just talking to him about, think about the trees outside, how they grow all different ways. And, we don't have a judgment about that. And just, little ways of deepening the connection to who we are and our good nature, and our clients' good nature. And I think from that place, then organically, we want to do things to help the planet.
Yes, I'm loving the reminder from you and from others of just how, in a way, how easy and immediate it can be to draw on either a brief experience directly outside, or like you say, through images, through metaphor, that it can begin being incorporated in these ways immediately, that it doesn't require a big shift to start doing that more. Yeah.
So earlier you had said, are you doing what you came here to do? I just want to ask you, are you doing what you came here to do? What is that exactly? Is that we can make a difference in climate change, or in the mental health world? How can we take care of ourselves in this, or just, and then something after that, you answer that.
That thing about listening within and questioning and listening to questions like, what have you come here to do? It is a practice I actively do engage. And I don't have a particular incident that opened my eyes to what seems to be happening in the world with climate. But I guess almost 10 years ago now, it just felt like my eyes were peeled back and I could never shut them again in terms of it. And I actually went into about 5 years of what felt like kind of heavy grief in this stage. Like it was just kind of with me all the time. And I asked myself a lot of questions about how can I be most impactful? You know, I'm not going to be, again, the engineer. I'm not going to be the climate scientist. And I did a lot of different things. I did a lot of, protest, advocacy work, policy work. But then at some point I realized, well, my strongest credential and my strongest experience base and perhaps my greatest influence is in my own field. So then that kind of started opening me up to, so what does that mean and what does it look like? And that's when I realized, in the introduction it was briefly mentioned, I worked for, I guess 25 years in a hospital in San Francisco, helping to create what's now the Institute for Health and Healing. And briefly what that is there are MDs who work alongside acupuncturists, with chiropractors, with nutritionists, with body workers, Ayurvedic perspectives, Feldenkrais, psychotherapy. I was bringing in also guided imagery as a part of psychotherapy. And it was a beautiful, and still is, a model of bringing the best of science with some more intuitive or body-based approaches. And the staff would literally be paid for an hour weekly to have a clinic meeting, so that if someone was in treatment with one or more practitioners there, we would all lend our voices, we would all lend our perspectives and help to collectively shape a healing path, which would then, of course, be revised and be in collaboration with the patient. But I realized it felt kind of like boot camp for this work, where I've seen one functional structure for multimodal, interdisciplinary, best of science, best of mind-body approaches work really, really well. And then I'm like, okay, so this is, in a sense, an ailing planet, an ailing patient where there's a need for healing and there's a need for a healing path. So how can I add my voice to an interdisciplinary model and really emphasize what, really the gifts that our field has to offer toward this that I don't think is being talked about very much yet. So then I felt like, okay, here's where I can, for now, kind of plant my feet and perhaps, provide the most influence, is where I, again, would like to get it into the training as well as bring it to seasoned practitioners and just raise the awareness, knowing also that as it gets adopted throughout our field, that is going to roll out to a lot of people. In the clients that we all work with. So it's just kind of my winding path. And it really did come through that questioning process. How can I be most effective now that, for whatever reason, this is kind of front and center in my view?
That's wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks. I think we're at the end of our time, so thank you.